Once I reach 1,000 subscribers, I will always have a live chat on the first Friday of the month at 8 p.m. So please subscribe, click on the bell, and let's get 1,000 subscribers very soon. Good morning and welcome back to Planet Althistory. Today we are going to discuss what if the Reconquista fails. The Reconquista was the period in the history of the Iberian Peninsula of about 780 years, between the Umayyad conquest of Hispania in 711 and the fall of Granada to the expanding Christian kingdoms in 1492. After the fall of Rome, Iberia was dominated mostly by the Visigoths, some parts were controlled by the Byzantines, and other parts were controlled by the Suebi. During the infighting and division across the Visigothic kingdom, the Islamic forces entered Iberia through the Strait of Gibraltar, as they were hired by someone who opposed the Visigothic kingdom of that time. And as the saying goes, when two fights, the third wins. And that's exactly what happened in Iberia during that time. Suddenly and almost out of nowhere, the Visigoths were totally destroyed and annihilated, and only the Franks were able to beat the Islamic forces. During the 8th century, the Muslim rulers consolidated their rule within Iberia, but they failed to control Galicia, Asturias, and places where Basque majority lived. The capital of Al-Andalus was Cordoba, and it became a very important city. The main problem for the Muslims was that they too had a lot of infighting and divisions. The Umayyads had the problem that communication was very complicated. Imagine sending a message from Damascus and trying to receive it in Cordoba in the 8th century. The infighting was so strong that at one time some or many local Muslim rulers ruled over their own territories, which they called taifas, but they were basically something like, I wouldn't even call it like an HRE or like Japan with the samurai and the shogunates, but you can imagine it very loosely like this. So there was still some unified idea that they were all under Al-Andalus, but at the end they were not all Al-Andalus, but they were somehow all subdivided into these different taifas. One of the first problems Al-Andalus had was that the recently Islamized Berbers had problems with the Arabs, who, despite being all Muslims, well, of course they favored the Arabs. I mean, if you're an Arabic person of that time, you would rather take an Arabic person than a Berber. With all the infighting just several years after the conquest of Iberia, the smaller Christian remnants could establish themselves and push the Muslims back for a bit. But what if this never happened? What if the Reconquista fails? The best point of divergence is that the Arabs would somehow know about the revolt of the Berbers, and they would either crush it or give them more rights in order to appease them. Of course, they would still not totally take over all of Iberia, but they would have a stronger hold over it, and the Christian kingdoms would have a smaller chance to reconquer their lost lands. This means that Spain and Portugal will not exist, and it will also have serious consequences on Christianity and on Europe as well. Europe will be redefined and have a more religious connotation as term, not Europe as geographical area, but the term of Europe. Everything that is Muslim, even within what we call Europe, would not be Europe, and thus Iberia would be grouped together with North Africa. The politics in Iberia would be very chaotic, and it is likely that for the next 300 years local Christian leaders and noblemen would try to fight and get some support from the Christian brothers until they would be forgotten and the situation would be seen as impossible to reverse. Rulers in Iberia would at first be Arabs, then we could have a Berber dynasty or Berber dynasties, and also get some native Muslim Iberian leaders. However, most of the time, the conflicts would be very much regional, and the only powers or geographical areas that could invade Iberia would only be France or Morocco. From Morocco, we could have many dynasties trying to control or dominate the whole area, while the French would try to take control in the Pyrenees, and they would even try to advance until Barcelona and other parts of Iberia. The Basque would probably resist fairly well until they would have to choose between Al-Andalus or France, and I suspect they would rather choose to be part of the French. Thus, the culture of Iberia would still be very influenced by the Romans, but mostly by the Arabs, later on by the Berbers, and slowly but surely an Iberian Muslim culture would appear. It is very possible that Arabic would never be spoken as native language within Iberia and only be a language of communication, just as Latin, for instance. The western part would have strong influence of the French. The eastern part would be very strongly influenced by the French, and only two identities that could somehow exist would be a very distinct Basque identity and a very Franco-Islamized Catalan culture. The other major consequence is that the Americas are not discovered by Portugal or Spain, but by another power. Perhaps France will conquer it or just discover it, perhaps the English or a Scandinavian kingdom could do it once more. Al-Andalus could become a maritime power as well if the Moroccans would be a major enemy of them. And because slavery was actually very much practiced by the Arabs and other Muslims until even today in some parts, Mauritania, it is very possible that Al-Andalus could establish trade ports around Africa and gain a monopoly on slaves. Spices could follow as well, and gold perhaps too, because of Mali. Gold could be one major motivation for the Europeans to still discover the Americas, but it is impossible to predict when it would happen. Because if once the Al-Andalus kingdom or emirate or whatever you want to call it, caliphate even, once they get a big monopoly or a huge position on gold, it would make the Europeans very furious, and it would kind of force them to go and look for it in another way. So that's how probably someone would come with the idea to search for gold in Japan or in India or China, and thus they would then somehow find the Americas. Europe and the whole world would be unrecognizable. Because of this change, where Iberia would be Muslim or stay as Al-Andalus, it would make many things very, very complicated. At first, as I said already before, you would have the whole thing with the Americas, then also the influence that the Portuguese and the Spanish had over Europe. Even during the wars in France or the HRE, the Spanish intervened many times. They intervened in Italy, they intervened in many places, even they had wars with the UK or England at that time. So it would change really a lot. Many countries and nations would not exist. It is even possible that the French would take most of Italy and even get parts of Netherlands, making it truly a big blue blob. It would mean that Napoleon would also never rise, that Germany might also be screwed, and at a certain point, war between France and Al-Andalus would be unavoidable. Not for religious reasons, but for political reasons. Islam could also change. It is very possible that Iberia would have their own version of Islam, which would reflect the geography, the culture, and the inhabitants of Iberia. However, it is not possible to determine which type of Islam this would be. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my video. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave a comment, support me also on Patreon, and join my forum, forum.planetalthistory.ga. Until next time on Planet Alt History.